What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the Dr. Vibe Show. And as always, saying you're blessed and highly favored, you're a magnet for miracles, and you're a solution for someone's problem. I'm the host and producer of the Dr. Vibe Show and other shows and platforms. We'll get to that at the end of our wonderful conversation tonight. Another special friend coming on the show tonight, and he was referred to me by a gentleman named Lawrence Rashid, who's a regular on the Do You Know What Time It Is Sunday night broadcast. Dr. Tommy J. Curry. He's an associate professor of philosophy and an affiliate professor of Africana Studies at Texas A&M University. The Aggies. Yes, the Aggies. That's the University of Johnny Manziel, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
That's it. That's right.
All right. All right. Yeah, well, I know a little bit something north of the border. He is a Rothrock fellow and has commented on social matters and venues ranging from Forbes to SiriusXM. He is the author of over 50 articles on issues of racism, anti-black violence, and intellectualization of black male death. He is working on his forthcoming books on black male vulnerability entitled Man Not and the Eschatology of Kanye West. We will have to find out how that title came about as we go on tonight. He is a strong advocate and thinker for the reconceptualization of black men and boys. He's adamant that the arguments used to justify their death and incarceration by black and white scholars alike must be challenged. Welcome to the show, Dr. Tommy J. Curry. How are you, my brother?
I'm good, sir. I'm good. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, you know what? Can you just call me Dr. Vibe? This sir thing, you're making me like I'm on a wheelchair. So Dr. Vibe is fine.
I got you, Dr.
I know it's going to take. All right. Now I feel you. That's good stuff. Well, before we get into the gist of our conversation tonight, outside of that wonderful little background that we shared with you online, where'd you grow up? What was life like, etc. growing up?
I'm from a small city, or it was a small city back then, Lake Charles, Louisiana. So I grew up in a town, was born in '79, so I grew up during the '80s. The town was still pretty much segregated. So it was a very strong line between black and white in that city. And most people, the only time that you interacted with white people was when they would bus you to school. So, it was an old school segregationist mentality. From that, I saw a lot. That's what kind of generated my interest in race and racism, these very strong delineations. My grandmother was actually a domestic worker in white families' homes. So that gives you a very different sensibility coming from the South and seeing how gender relations, sexuality, and violence actually work to keep black people in order. Jim Crow didn't die in the 1950s where I was from. So it was a very illuminating experience into some of the structures that academics like to theorize about today.
That's fantastic. Now, so growing up, how did race impact your life, and how did you get so passionate, especially in the area of black males?
Man, growing up, like I said, everything was split. No matter how good your grades were, no matter how smart you were, how articulate you were, how well you did in school, there was always a sharp division. You would go to school with white students and you'd see how white students would be treated differently, how stereotypes would be used against black boys, especially to talk about them as violent and troublemakers. I remember being in junior high and they were these, white athletes. They used to pick with black boys all the time. And no matter who started the fight, in every case, the black male was the one that was brought to the principal's office and was labeled as a troublemaker. I was a high academic achieving, black male. So the stereotypes that affected me were a little different. I got part of the thing that said I was angry, violent, etc. for liking things that, young boys like my uncle was in the Air Force and, Desert Storm was going on back then. I wrote him a letter and asked him if I could have a hollowed out grenade. The
Wow.
comment that my teacher made to me was, you're violent, obsessed with violence and death, so I realized that, there's something different, in terms of how I was treated. And then as I got older, you saw violence. I remember I was walking home from S.J. Welsh. It's a middle school out in Lake Charles, Louisiana, with a good friend of mine, Henry. And a white boy was in a car in the passenger seat. We were walking by him. We're in what, 7th, 8th grade at this point,
Right.
maybe younger. And he called us niggers. and he spit on my friend's face.
Oh my gosh.
And and that's what it was like growing up. To this day, it's funny because my wife and I constantly argue that when we take walks with the kids, I never walk on open streets because of that. So that's the kind of experience that I grew up with. So the passion for race and racism literally comes from seeing how it affected your life, seeing how white people could do pretty much whatever they wanted to you, and you get the excuse that, hey, I felt threatened, I felt unsafe, he looked dangerous, and this becomes kind of a popular conscience that they have towards black men, and this seems to imbue everything that white society does, from interactions on the street to simple interactions that you have even in the academy. So I don't think there's any close. Well, I'll say it this way. I know, given the research, that there's no class elevation that protects black men from violence.
Do you feel we haven't even got to our main question? We're already on a good
Sure.
roll, but this is good. Do you feel, as you've gone through your journey as a black man, has the conditions or the environment got better, stayed the same, or gotten worse?
That's a tough question. I think, given where I'm from, it removed me from some of the very real issues of poverty and political neglect. Lake Charles is not a very rich city, especially when you're a black person. So, given that I'm out of that environment, it certainly helped. On the other hand, black men, especially in the university, are confronted with all types of microaggressions and very blatant racism. So anytime a black man, for instance, like, I make it very clear that I study black men and boys. I'm very sympathetic to the plight of black women because I write on them as well. I do the intellectual history, but I don't have the same experience that my wife will have. I don't have the same experiences that my daughters are going to grow up with. But I have to keep in mind that because, black men and black women affect each other. They're in a symbiotic relationship in many ways. There are mothers, etc. I'm interested in how that works out. But in the university, if you don't pick the right subject, so if you're not saying that you're a black feminist, if you're not saying that you endorse these types of politics, then it becomes very difficult to talk about the violence and the marginalization that black men suffer. So the types of stresses and the types of confrontations and battles you have in the academy is literally that people try to put you, look back to, you're the type of person of where you came from. It's this constant push that despite your degrees, despite your sensibilities, that you're just a common thug. And this isn't a perception that just happens with white people. There's also a class dynamic within the university where certain classes of black people also buy into that pathological mentality about black men. So it's a battle. Most of it is psychological. A lot of it is microaggressions. Some of it is blatant racism. Most of the time is issue of preference, not being called back on a job, or finding out that once you interview, people thought you were scary, that you were dangerous. All kind of racist stereotypes affect you. It's just a question of how you take it. At a very real level, because I'm still in the southern city. It's an all-white school, practically all-white campus. So I'm constantly dealing with issues of being stopped, constantly having my credentials questioned. I remember I had a student in a 1-hour course on incarceration say, "Oh, Dr. Curry, how did you get to Texas A&M?" And as I was about to answer him, he said, "Oh, I know they were doing something with affirmative action a few years ago." So, this is the type of daily confrontations you have here.
In some ways, it sounds like things have gotten better.
No, the dynamics changed, but it hasn't. I mean, we've been in situations even within my department where very racist things against black men have been said. How they feel dangerous with black men, how black men are unqualified. All these things happen constantly. So the question really becomes, which poison do you pick? The economic marginalization, or somewhat of a middle class existence under the constant reign and terror of white middle class people that impose stereotypes on you. It's a very difficult dynamic to kind of to navigate.
I hear you. So let's, and I'm getting a little bit of feedback on your end. I don't know if we can turn the speakers down a little bit.
Sure.
Okay, can you still hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And the listeners, thank you more. So let's continue on. So black male vulnerability. Break it down for us. What does that mean to you? What does this mean in America today?
Absolutely. Black male vulnerability is the name that I've given overall to the conditions and disadvantages that black males suffer. Traditionally, because of the proliferation of intersectional thought, the idea is that because black men are black on the race component, but are still male because of the sex or gender component, that black men still have some sort of male advantages. Now, even though these advantages can't be proven economically, sociologically, historically, this is nonetheless the kind of conceptual model that people are using to understand black men. What I'm trying to say, or what I'm trying to introduce, is a very different idea, that black men are extremely vulnerable because of their positions as male. So if you think about authors like Frantz Fanon, for instance, he makes a great point. He says that, you know, the Negro doesn't only relate to the white man as a Negro, he also relates and is alienated because he's a man. So there's this question of being a white man in a patriarchal society and then being a black man in a patriarchal society. The theories that we have in the university suggest to us that that's only a mimetic relationship, meaning that black men see white men and they only want to be like white men. What I'm trying to suggest is that history doesn't prove that out. It doesn't hash out that assumption. What it actually shows is that black men have had a very real disdain and distrust of white men. And because of that, because they haven't been able to rise and accelerate or assimilate rather into those upper echelons of class and whiteness and white values the same way that other groups have, that they're especially vulnerable. They're vulnerable to police brutality. They're vulnerable to incarceration. They're vulnerable to domestic abuse. They're vulnerable to sexual assault and rape at 62 times, you know, their white male counterpart. They're vulnerable to death. They're vulnerable to unemployment. They're vulnerable to poverty, right? There's all these empirical sociological conditions and realities that affect black men that are never talked about or studied. It's simply made generic, lumped into our understanding of race, and then that gets kind of deconstructed and challenged all throughout the university. When we have a very real statistic like 100 black men have died this year at the hands of police, whereas 5 to 10 black women have died, and you know that number is probably much higher, right? Because we just don't know of all the information. But when you have that kind of gap, the way that black men are affected by anti-black violence, I ask a very simple question. If they're vulnerable to death and violence, why then are we not studying them? And over again, I don't find, you know, compelling answers to how we do not account for black male vulnerability, their actual conditions, their actual exploitations, their actual disadvantage next to their white and black counterparts.
Number of conversation pieces that we need to look at there. First, and I think we need to turn the speaker down again because we're getting a little more feedback. Okay. Great. A number of conversation pieces come out of there. You had mentioned that black men have a disdain for white men. Am I correct, quoting you correctly, or
yes?
Okay. Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, I'm saying historically, when you think, if you're taking a gauge of black political thought, how black men have thought of themselves in this society, it hasn't been one of emulation. It's one where they look at white violence, police violence, the Klan, their inability to get jobs, as one where white men have certain racial advantages that they cannot hope to have. So when you have the language in the 1960s and 70s of the man running things, the government, the state, the pigs, etc., this shows that black men are engaging in a disdain and deconstruction of what it means to be a white patriarch in this society. That means that they don't have the kind of emulation that current theories like black feminism or intersectionality suggest that they do in regards to white men. And we see this even in our daily politics. I mean, when you look at something like hip hop, we look at the political disdain that you get from someone like an Immortal Technique or Most Def or, you know, any number, you know, of rappers. I mean, you can look at Jay Electronica, Kendrick Lamar, even Kanye West to a certain extent. You can see that there's this engagement where they're like, look, racism has an economic effect on the options that black men have. I think this is why you also see such high levels of depression, underperformance, et cetera, of black men and boys in academic institutions. They just don't feel that they too can be like white men, that that's an unattainable standard. So when you look both at the trajectory that we have through education and class mobility through jobs, as well as the political side of whether or not they have the same interest in political goals as many white males in America, I think you see a very clear break in those attitudes.
And you've also reflected in our conversation also that tonight that no one wants to study this.
Yes.
Why not? And then who should take the tip of the spear, so to speak, to start studying this?
Right, right. Well, let me qualify that a bit. I mean, there's wonderful work being produced on black men and boys, brown men and boys in education. I think there's a good amount that's being done by some sociologists. I think, however, when it comes to theoretical fields like philosophy, to a lesser extent history, gender studies, these types of things, there's a resistance in even approaching black men as victims. The idea within these fields is that black men are patriarchs, are many patriarchs, aspiring patriarchs, that they are violent, that they have a history of trying to dominate women. It's very much an old school Duluthian model. This idea that domestic abuse happens because men are involved, because of the high rates of domestic abuse in, in black communities. The idea is that black men are dangerous to black women and children, right? These are the kinds of mythologies that affect how we look at black men. Because they're set up largely as a problematic, as a category of person that no one really wants to be. There's not a push, there's not a desire, there's no incentive to know anything about the history of black men or approach them as being vulnerable subjects. They're many dominators, they're many patriarchs. And it's this mythology, which has absolutely no basis in history. It's anecdotal. Like you can point to one or two or a dozen instances, but that's not the 200 or 300 year history of black manhood in this country. So I think there has to be a re-education and re-socialization of how we think of black men and boys. Right now, it's dominated largely through a black feminist historiography, and of course with a feminist historiography, meaning that you generally have white feminists making the argument that because they're men, they're problematic and patriarchs in the society, and you even have some black feminists using or rationalizing it through an intersectional model, suggesting that because black men are still male, they might not have the same advantages of white men, but they certainly still aspire to patriarchy and domination over women to make themselves men. These conversations are prolific; they run rampant. And the problem is that when you try to study black men, there you get this reaction, like how you're taking focus away from black women. You're silencing black women. I've given a paper on black men being raped during slavery, and I was booed by a black feminist in the audience because she suggested that paper rapes black women. And I said, well, look, you have to expand beyond the idea of every violence between white men and white women and black peoples as being heteronormative. Certainly, you're not contending that only heterosexual white men and heterosexual white women came over from Europe and colonized the New World. Surely there were people who had homosexual or homoerotic tendencies towards black men and black women. And if we look at it in that way, then we see different vulnerabilities. We see white men actually desiring to rape black boys. We see white women, because of their racial power and status, actually desiring to dominate black males and boys with sexuality. So these types of nuances, this historical reality, should overall change the way that we account for blackness and anti-black violence. But very rarely does it, because ideology stops you, first and foremost. They're not subjects of study. They're subjects of problems. They are the problem to be studied. They're the problem to be rejected and studied, in light of other subjects. Like black women are more important, women are more important, children are more important. They're never centered in intellectual inquiry.
From what you just shared with me, again, the number of things, I think it sounds like sometimes you have quite a battle. Is that
That's putting it lightly. That's putting it lightly.
Why do you feel there's such a battle to accept your thoughts?
Well, I mean, look, it runs against the last 30 or 40 years of the development of gender theory, right? So if you look at the academy, what you find are white people overwhelmingly dominated. White women are the second largest group in it. They're fighting for their place largely off of the language of gender. So the same way that affirmative action happened, where black people fought to be included in the workforce, to get in education, in higher institutions of higher learning, and white women were able to take that over. So, black people remain disadvantaged despite the idea that they had a whole civil rights movement to pass a policy. And I think that that's the great irony of America, that even though we had a movement that allegedly dealt with race, it ended up benefiting white women on the basis of gender more than it did the racial group as a whole. So the academy is very much the same way. We've created an issue where white women have been allowed into the academy. They've created certain narrative and discourses. You can problematize it from the view of a black feminist or black queer or queer identity, but overall, they're the second most powerful group in the university. So when you have some of these ideas that hold white women accountable for the rape of black men, when you hold ideas that show that white women participated in lynching black men and participated in castrating black men, right? You know, when you show that there's a very vicious racism that drove white women to create clan organizations so that black men couldn't vote and couldn't own property and couldn't work and couldn't open businesses, then this pushes back against the 30 or 40 years of victimization thought that's been inculcated with gender studies. And this is part of the battle. And you just translate that. Think about that. You translate black men saying, look, during Jim Crow, during slavery, white women had the power to victimize, rape, and sexually coerce black males. And then you put that in context, and it challenges all of black feminist historiography. Because now it's not just the black female being raped by the white man, but it's now the black male being raped by the white man and the white woman. So this changes then how we think about the orientation that black men had during the civil rights movement. People say that black men wanted the right to vote. They wanted the right to have politics. They wanted the right to own property, to have jobs, etc., to own homes, businesses, etc. But then if you say, well, what if these black men were fighting on the basis of a shared sexual victimization? This is Danielle McGuire's work, right? Then it means that it changes the whole way that we look at history. And disciplines are not very apt to change. It becomes much easier to attack a black male talking about black men and black history as some black macho that Michelle Wallace was talking about that just wants to talk about race and dominate, right? It's all caricature. So being a black male leaves you vulnerable when you say things that are not popular. And I think that that's, you know, the university is both trying to preserve itself and it's trying to make sure that these types of ideas and this type of work, which has already been done in many other fields, doesn't make it into theory.
I want to spend some time having you share with us in regards to black male death as sexual violence. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a few things. I think that the lessons we learned out of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, before the birth of the Black Panther Party, is that black men have also experienced sexual violence at the hands of white people. Now, traditionally, we think of that only in relationship to lynching. So we put up the lynching photos. We show the black man that's castrated. You know, we show, I mean, this is Baldwin's famous essay, you know, Going to Meet the Man, you know, where the sheriff can't get an erection. He can't make love to his white wife, but he becomes stiff. He becomes hard when he starts thinking about the very first lynching he saw, where a white man grabbed the testicles of a black man before he cut them off and they burned his body to a crisp during a lynching. So we have these very vivid depictions. You see very similar, you know, accounts in Richard Wright. But when black men say, look, we have a history where racial violence has also contained this sexual component, people don't want to do that, because notice what that move means. It means not only that white people are racist and anti-black, but it also means that white men and white women hate the object of their desire. So this becomes very problematic because it casts whiteness and white people and white supremacy in a very, very different light. It means that now white men aren't simply heterosexual patriarchs. They're also homosexual or homoerotic beings that are trying to dominate and castrate black men for their own pleasure. So when I talk about violence and desire and the homoeroticism of black death, I ask myself, what is it that becomes so desired? What is it that white men crave in these killings of black men such that it happens over and over again? So when we see black boys shot, why do we see so many pictures of black males' dead bodies? Why do we see so many pictures on YouTube? Why do we see so many pictures of how black men die, but not very many pictures of how black men live? And given this history, where we now have an eroticism, this object of desire, this black male body, the need to castrate him, the need to kill him, the need to make sure that he exists only as a criminal and not in relationship to either white men or white women, how do we think about that in relationship to what's happening right now? Like, I'll give you a great example. I mean, there was a 16-year-old boy, Darren Manning. You know, a female cop grabbed his testicles so hard, he said that he heard an audible pop. We know that we have the, you know, Amadou Lumina case a few years back from New York, you know, where he was sodomized by a plunger from a police officer. We have a case with Deion Payne. Two white men anally raped him and then killed him. right? Like we see there are actual examples of black men being sodomized in their murder. Yet these things don't become very popularized. We have the Eric Glover case, him and his friend Terrence Rankin and Joliet. Four white people killed him and then had an orgy on top of their bodies. And this was back in 2013. Didn't receive any media coverage. So what I'm trying to suggest to people is that we have these deaths that are fundamentally related to the sexualization of black men and boys' bodies. And we completely ignore it because our conceptual frame, our cultural frame says that men cannot be victims of sexual violence. That is something that only belongs to the female body. And that's what I'm trying to push against. I'm trying to use actual examples, tie that to history, and show that the types of deaths that we see happening to black men are not simply based on racial antipathy or aversion, but also based in a kind of eroticism that's being acted out upon black male bodies that's not being addressed in terms of our thought or our policy.
This is a very deep subject, and I know that we can go on further on this.
Oh no, absolutely, yeah. This is
Our time is limited, but what are the events in your country over the last 18 months taught you, exposed to you, made you go deeper, make you more passionate?
It's, I don't know if it's passion, Dr. Vibe. It's it's very difficult. I'll give you an example. My students asked me if I've seen the movie Fruitville Station.
Right.
And I told them that I couldn't. I told them I just can't bring myself to watch another film about a black man dying where the reason we made the movie is to try to convince people that he was a human being. And so when I see so many black men, and my wife is a sociologist, so we look at these numbers all the time, and I get depressed when I see how many black women are in jail, around 65,000, in prison and jail. And then I almost break down in tears when I look at how many black men are in jail, which is 950,000. So my passion comes from the fact that we have a fundamental misunderstanding about what it means to be both a black male in this society and to suffer because you're a black male in this society. And we're constantly told, and I see this all the time. I see black men at conferences that say anything about themselves or talk about how they're fearful or how they're anxious or how depressed they feel because yet another black man died. And I hear people tell them literally to shut up, that we're not talking about black men anymore, that you're a passe subject, that you already have too much attention. And I ask myself, if black men have all this attention and we're going to fight black men and black women are going to fight for the spotlight, then why doesn't it click on anybody that the spotlight doesn't prevent people from dying? So if they got all the attention now and they're still dying, what are we fighting for? And it becomes depressing because it hasn't arrested the number of deaths. It hasn't stopped or gotten any of the police who've killed black men largely convicted by and large. It hasn't changed the way that we look at black men as being victims rather than criminals. We fundamentally believe, and this is part of the culture, we fundamentally believe that black men are pathological, that at the very root of who they are, there is a seed, a germ of evilness that can sprout out at any moment. So then who challenges those stereotypes? Because they're deployed at different times for different means. If someone doesn't like me in the university, or if I disagree with a white person, they simply get to say not that they didn't read, but I'm angry or aggressive. If I walk into the wrong situation in College Station, I can be shot. If a student accuses me of something, I can be arrested, right? See, that's the vulnerability. So when you ask what happened in the last 18 months, it's the conditions that I see black men suffering under, both being fearful and anxious and depressed because they're being killed, and also not being able to speak to anyone because no one wants to talk about black men such that you can address any of the issues that they feel that they have. So I figured that they need a voice, that we need some scholarship that at least offers a theoretical account of black males' existence in America.
Now, you certainly talk about an environment you're very used to, the educational environment. What do you hear from black men outside of the educational environment?
Man, it's tough. I still talk to my family, in Louisiana. I still have a very active, engagement with people outside the university is tough, man. It's anger, it's depression. You know, it's when you meet black men and they just seem cold, that distance that you give a brother a head nod, but that there's just that distance there.
Yep.
And that's what I find. And it becomes heartbreaking because there's so much brilliance and warmth that black men have, especially black men in the South, because black men in the South will work themselves to death just to live up to the idea that they've taken care of their family and they're not the stereotype of what black men have historically been defined as. And despite their work, despite their religiosity, despite their faith, they still have to deal with a reality where the society itself and many people responsible for policies and even thinking about society will not acknowledge them. And that's what I hear from them. I hear depression and anger, but it becomes silence. It becomes something that we take on for ourselves. And as you know, I mean, this is why we are disproportionately affected by things like stress, high blood pressure, cancers, etc. We take all that inside of us because we don't have an outlet. And given that people are not very willing to study black men, we don't know exactly what depression looks like in black men. We don't know how to address it. We go our whole lives without anyone asking us how we're doing. How do we feel about a subject? Because the idea is that if we feel anything about a subject, it has to be wrong because we're black males. So I'm trying to fight against that. I'm trying to create a world, or at least a scholarship where people can have voice, where they can say, look, the reason that we're going through this, the reason that we see this, look at Curry, he went to the university, but he's still talking about the problems that affected him in Lake Charles, Louisiana, right? That's kind of that's what I hear, and that's how I'm trying to address it.
We've spent a lot of time sharing tonight, or having you share about the narrative that's being controlled by those who are not black. But what do you feel black men or blacks in general can do to start controlling the narrative about black men from their source?
Well, look, I mean, I think we need a re-education about what black men have done throughout history. I mean, if are we talking about the university, or you mean like in society, in our communities?
Whatever. I think let's take a look at both platforms.
Sure. I think in the university, we need to seriously challenge the historical legitimacy and veracity of the black macho. In 1999, Michelle Wallace wrote a new introduction for her Verso edition of the Black Macho that really does expose that it's not a full study, that it was done from her impressions of watching the news, that she based it on two people, her stepfather and her father. She even admits at one point in the book that she wished she never wrote it because the thing has no journalistic, historical, or sociological proof. Yet this becomes the Bible of interpreting how black men have historically engaged politics from the 1800s all the way to now. And there's very little critique of this kind of ideology outside of the debates in the 1970s, because the idea, and this is the most ironic part, even though you had women like Paula Giddings writing harsh criticisms of this, saying that this is nothing more than mythology and not history, people decided to go with that mythology over and against the empirical work in history and of other sociologists like Joyce Ladner, LaFrancis Rogers Rose, etc. So there needs to be a theoretical reorientation and an actual learning about what black men have historically done. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that black men become perfect. Of course, black men have been sexist, they've been religious fundamentalists, they've been conservative. They're human beings and they live within their time period. But none of their flaws are flaws that are unshared by not only the women in their group, but people of the other times. So until we stop mythologizing black men as these evil boogeymen that are victimized, but really have all this hate from their victimization and want to dominate everyone else, then these kinds of theoretical accounts of black men as sexist, misogynistic, violent, and dangerous are going to keep creeping into the theories, which is why you see only one side of this narrative produced out of liberal arts. There's no other history. From undergrad to graduate courses, everyone's taught one history of black men. Black men are bad. Black men sought to dominate everyone else. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that we have to create spaces where black men can study other black men. This is not something that's available now. In this country, there's not one job in black masculinity studies. There's not one. There's not a job in black manhood studies. There's a growing area of men's studies, but you find very little interest in people willing to even explore what masculinity means. And this isn't just some kind of heterosexual valorization of black male victimization. This is saying, what does it mean to understand black men as homosexual, heterosexual, whatever plurality of masculinity they embrace or define themselves as. But that still doesn't appeal to people because the problem is the subject matter. That you're trying to study black men as if they are a subject that has experiences and produce theory and have a historical legacy that's outside of what we already say. That vastly needs to change. Black men still are the largest victims of poverty, unemployment, incarceration, and death in this country. We're outnumbered in the university by over 20,000 to our female counterparts. Black women get 60 to 70% of all the degrees. This has been happening for 30 years. Since 1954, black women have been getting more degrees than black men. Now, that doesn't mean that we should somehow malign black women because they're succeeding academically, but it means that it creates a kind of demographic context. So if you have a lot of black women who are moving into the academy that's in the university, then that certain types of theories are going to appeal to them. So that's why you have this kind of hegemonic force of black feminism. It has a sociological explanation. You outnumber black men. You've been trained this way from undergrad. You have a certain class advantage that black men don't have. So many black men are still first generation, especially if we're talking about black men for the South. So there's going to be very different class biases that these upper class women, by and large, are going to have of lower class black men. All this means that these are ripe areas of study for us to understand gender and sex relations and sex roles in the black community better. But right now, all of that is shut down. In our community, we have to do something, man. We have to link what we know empirically about black men to how black families and communities understand the black men in their community and how people treat them. And this is what I mean by this, is that largely in black communities, especially Southern black communities, the way that we deal with black men is either through religion, which many of us reject because of the violence in the society, or it's through kind of this imbued self-defeatism that we've done everything we could for them. Let's just leave them be. All right. The high academic achieving black male is very rare. And when we do see him, we largely designate him as effeminate. We don't largely reward academic success in our black males. And that's not only the black community's fault. That's also that we have a disproportionate amount of white teachers in schools that are kind of determining the culture of how we understand and how we deal with black men in the classroom. So if we have black men who are constantly not having academic success, they're constantly unemployed, they constantly find themselves in the same conditions and environment, then it's going to be that environment of poverty and unemployment and despair on top of the external pressures of violence and anti-blackness that's going to cultivate the personality of these young men. So that means that our community then has to respond better to how conditions internally, the message they're getting from academic institutions, primary school, secondary school, etc., and how these images in society and the policies are coming together to create a mentality in black males that are largely disengaged. And that's not the conversation we're having in black churches. We're trying to give men religion to substitute for an awareness about how history and sociology coalesce with economics to keep them in a certain position. And if we're not teaching them that, if we're not literally saying, here's what you're at risk for, here's what's going to happen to you. Here's why, for example, the teacher says that, Tawanda is smart, but you're dumb. If we don't understand these gender dynamics, even in the classroom in our communities, then we're not going to be able to bring black men to a position where they have enough self-agency and self-assertion to say, it's not me, where they don't internalize that oppression. It's not me, it's the condition, so I can succeed despite it. And that's the problem.
And certainly the challenge, and you just spent some time, and we spent a lot of time tonight sharing about the status in the educational world. But what about the home? What about the community?
Well, that's what I mean. I mean, all these things affect the home. When you have young men that are either killed, incarcerated, right, or just kind of disengaged, then this puts a pressure on who's earning money, who's engaged with children. All this affect. You see, this is what I mean. This is what I mean when I say that. You've seen some of the gender wars we have on Twitter, right? This is what I mean when I say that they don't understand the symbiotic relationship between men and women. See, despite all of our politics, we still have an overwhelming amount of black men and women who are still trying to build homes and have heterosexual relationships. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not having other kind of relationships, but we know that we have a disproportionate amount of those relationships. And we know that those homes are largely vulnerable because we don't have two people working. We have policies that attack Black women in terms of access to social services, that attacks them in terms of disproportionate, less income for what they work next to white women and white men, and they still have more burdens with more children. And you take that economic situation where they have more dependents, getting paid less and discriminated in the workforce, and a Black male who's unemployed or in jail or dead. So how then does the Black home, and think about this, these are multiple Black homes in these communities. How does the Black home respond? So you have the Black female that's in economic marginalization, disadvantage, but still has children to take care of. You have Black men that are largely disengaged because of their upbringing, because of the culture they're in, because of the fact that they're impoverished or unemployed, can't get jobs, or are dead. So then what culture does that give both the men in that community that are not there and the women that are struggling in it? This is the function of political economics, how we create certain situations and value through self-interest. If we have a racist society, then why do we suddenly believe that this racist society is going to try to bring up Black families? Why do we believe that they're going to assert self-esteem within Black men? Why do we think they're going to allow Black women the type of income to flourish to teach Black children? See, this is the interconnectedness of how we think about how white supremacy functions in the world. And white supremacy plays out on male bodies and female bodies differently. The same way that it makes Black women workers with dependents and has them raise kids that in many ways can't function because of both the economic pressure and them not being there, is the same way that those same Black children are punished and criminalized because they don't see that they have a future and they become the scapegoat of the white society. But these aren't the conversations that we're teaching people. We're not teaching people to analyze Black families as a subset of the repression that we get from a white supremacist culture. We pretend the Black family doesn't matter because all we care about are men and women, are trans and gay people, are queer and queer people. See, we've fallen back on identity because identity is subjective. I can feel that I'm one thing one day and change it. I can define myself any way I want. I could declare who I am and demand people recognize me. But when you start saying that we have to have a knowledge of history and economics, that we need to know what's happening in these poor Black communities, then nobody wants to go there. And part of the reason we don't want to go there is because the class dynamic of Black intellectuals in the university fundamentally pathologize and have an aversion to poor Black people. So the reason that many of these upper class Black people don't want to focus on the Black family is because they fundamentally have a disdain from the Black communities that they left to get to the university. Now, they'll pimp them out when they want something like a higher salary or talk about how oppressed they are in the university, but they have a fundamental distance from the communities that they come from or claim to represent and who they are now. So that's why the theories never mirror what's happening to Black families, what's happening to Black women with 2 children and no jobs, what's happening to Black women who are college educated but can't get employment that with an income that's comparable to their white counterparts. What does it mean for the children they raise? What does it mean for the Black male children they raise? What happens to the Black males in that situation? Was he killed? Can he get a job? Is he educated? Who hires? Right? These are the problems that we have. And our families are falling apart. Our children are falling apart. Our communities are falling apart. And I think you can see this even in the political representation. That Black men, largely because lack of education, economic things are driven into incarceration systems, are dead, and they don't have political power to even vote. I laugh when I hear how many people say that, there was a Black male president, so that shows that Black men have privilege, but not realizing that it was 56% of Black women who voted him in. They hold a majority vote in the Black community. So it's these silly ideological identity politics that have absolutely no answer to empiricism, to what actually happens, that creates these issues between Black men and women. Instead of just saying, look, let's study the relationship that the death of Black men and boys have to the Black community. You think, just look at Ayanna Stanley. I always look at these social media pages and they're like, oh, say her name. And we should remember Ayanna Stanley. When I was on Sirius, I did a whole, thing on because it really bothered me because I have 2 little girls. And I said, but the thing is that you missed the no-knock raid. They were accusing her father of conspiring to kill someone. So they did a no-knock raid. She gets killed. The same thing with Rekia Boyd. A Black man gets shot in his wrist, Alexander Cross, and she gets shot in the head. So by accident. So we look at social media and they try to separate these 2 things. What I'm saying is because of how they police Black people, specifically come in and try to kill Black men, that Black women end up killed. It's making our overall communities it's putting all of our communities under surveillance. is using violence on everyone because they have a specific target, because they have a notion of a black male that's a super predator and that's a criminal. But that's an unpopular conversation because it shows the interrelatedness and the coreness that black men have in these communities, both in terms of their positivity and the negativity their criminalization brings to black households. But it's much easier to kind of just say, well, Rekia Boyd was shot by, Officer Servant without any kind of context. And this is what I mean. We're not trying to understand black men as communal, historical, and active beings. We just look at them as if they're largely distant and not there. So gender creates a world where we invalidate their relation to women, focus on women, and then we say anytime they say something, we say they don't matter. And it's a very unfortunate thing. We're not going to solve problems that way.
And you tell me you're not passionate. Okay. Well, before we let you go, and we've come to the end of the show, there's something that's in my mind that I want to ask you. Because of the advancement of black women in society ahead of black men, is that a concern? Should the black community be concerned about that? Well,
I mean, we should be concerned because I think we get what we usually find, right? Is that there are less partners, there's less colleagues, there are less marriageable people for women who have achieved. But
and Tommy, I just want to add to that conversation piece. What effect do you feel that is having on black male vulnerability?
Oh, okay. So look, a few things. I think you need people from the group to theorize about the group, right? So you have a kind of frustration, and it's an understandable frustration. But if you have a frustration for upper class black women that they don't have suitable mates, and I think you hear this all the time, right? You heard this with Kenya Moore. You hear this. There was a recent thing with Issa Rae and a few other women saying there's, one guest said that it's finding a good black man is like finding $100 bill on Wall Street in Manhattan, right? These are the views, that there are no good, educated, moral character, worthy black men available for black women. So I think it creates two things. I think it creates a disdain among these class women. And I think it creates, because of that disdain, it becomes a situation where they ignore the vulnerabilities and the conditions that give rise to it. For example, I had a conversation at a recent talk where a black woman's like, black men are marrying all these white women, so black women. And I asked her, I was like, do you know the percentage of black men that marry outside of their race? And she said 30-something%. And I was like, it's under 10. It varies between 6 and 8. So that's the misperception we have. So I think that when we have such a high academic and business-oriented, legal, education, whatever because they work in all different constellations, success of black women, then we have to look at the types of attitudes that class difference between black women and black men make. So we need to actually study black women's attitudes towards black men and vice versa. By not doing that, then I don't think that we're ever going to bridge that gap. And if we're not going to start talking about the ways that things like the prison industrial complex are affecting the number of black men that's available. Wall Street Journal, maybe it was the New York Times, just came about with that article, 1.5 million black men are missing. They're either dead or in jail. We're already outnumbered by black women by 2 million in this country. So you're knocking it down even farther. And the age groups between this is 25 and 34, which is largely, marrying age between, for young people. So we have a lot of problems. We have a demographic problem, and then we have an ideological problem where certain classes of black women, because of their successes, don't see men as being necessarily men or vulnerable to this racist society, because they say, look, the men should just work harder. They buy into this kind of, Protestant ethic. We worked hard, they work hard too, without understanding the unique vulnerabilities black men have to death, violence, and, and incarceration.
Well, Tommy, on that note, we're going to fade it out in regards to tonight. And I know that I don't have to ask about solutions because intertwined with your concerns and your passion that you said you don't have, you offered solutions to this situation. And first things first, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your positive.
No, I appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
And would love to have you back on if and when you're ready. And if people want to touch base with you, how can they do that?
They can get me on Twitter at Dr. DRTJC, or they can hit me up on my email, my university account, tjcurry@tamu.edu.
Oh, it's excellent. And it sounds like you're a tennis fan.
Oh yeah, no, I love tennis. I love tennis, man. It's one of the oldest black sports in this country. Many people don't know that. First sport where we had co-ed black men and women.
Excellent. Are you feeling that Serena will win the French Open?
I'm actually not a Serena fan, but I mean,
Oh,
likely she will.
okay, no problem. We'll leave it. It is right there.
I know that was dropping the bomb there.
Yeah, there you go. Well, it's Dr. Vibe here. I'm your host and producer of the Dr. Vibe Show. I am host and producer of the weekly Black Men's Roundtable on most Sunday evenings at 9 p.m. Eastern called Do You Know What Time It Is? I'm also the producer and co-host of the weekly podcast on Monday evenings for a White House proposal on men and boys. And also you can catch me once a month hosting and co-producing the Good Men Project show at thegoodmenproject.com, the conversations that no one else is having. Like we always like to say, you're blessed and highly favored. You're a magnet for miracles, and you're a solution for someone's problem. God bless, peace, will, and keep the faith. And thanks for everyone who was watching this live and all the people checking it out on Twitter. We appreciate it and don't take it for granted. Catch you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.